Hello, and welcome back to the history of beer with Brian from Beervana. In our first episode, we talked about the beginning of beer on Earth and ancient beer. Now we're going to move into episode 2, the birth of beer styles. As civilization left the Fertile Crescent and started moving around the world and into Europe is where these styles were born, we saw each region defining their own styles. From the UK in the west to Germany and what is now Austria and Czech in the east, we saw the birth of styles that we know and love today. So around this time in the early history of beer styles, we're in the Middle Ages in Europe, and styles started to form around the year 1000. Beer at this time was brewed often by monks in monasteries and by women in the household. The women were known as alewives. In both cases, the beer was brewed consumption as well as for sale. A lot of people were drinking beer at this time because they knew that it was safer than water. Beer was boiled and fermented, which made it much safer than the drinking water that was available. They didn't know exactly why it was safer, but when you drank beer, you didn't die. So people continued to drink beer. This is where things like hops and the definitions of style started to form, things like the classification between lager and ale. It's around the year 1000 where hops have the first record in the brewing world. We start seeing recipes using hops. It's a little bit later than this that styles started to form, and in Germany and the East, people were brewing what they call lagers or pilsners, colder fermentation beers. In the West, they were brewing ales, which are warmer fermentation beers. The oldest style that we know of that's specific is Gose, a German sour beer that's slightly salty. And it's around the year 1000 that the first record of Gose exists. It was called Gose from the valley where it originated, the Gosar Valley in Germany. What I would say was the first clear style of beer that we have a record of. Just a few years later, officially the year 10,040, is when Weinhenstephaner, they were certified as a brewery, and they're considered the oldest continually operational brewery in the world. They're famous for wheat beers. And so you can clearly see that styles of beer were being formed around this time. Beer making was officially recognized as a commercial enterprise in countries like what we now know as Austria, Czech, Germany, Bavaria, and also to the west, the UK, Ireland, and Belgium. People at this time had recognized that beer was a commercially viable enterprise. People have heard of Pilsner, a famous style of beer. It's originally from the town of Pilsen, which is now in Czech. And these beers were famous because of the clarity of the beer and the crisp water profile. Pilsners are one of the most popular beer styles in the world today, and they can trace their origin back to around 1200 AD in the town of Pilsen. They knew that everyone was drinking it, and they started to form official breweries. They named them, they got certified, and they started making the styles that we know today. A bit further west, you have other beers being formed in Germany, and the first brewers' guilds are starting to be formed. Around 1516, they enacted the Reinheitsgebot, or the German beer purity law, as the first food safety or food purity law that we know of, which declared that beer could only contain 3 ingredients: malt or barley, hops, and water. But even under this limiting restriction, the German brewers were creative enough to create hundreds of styles of beers, from sweet, malty Doppelbocks to crisp, refreshing lagers and pilsners, as well as slightly sour beers like Gose and Berliner Weiss. They didn't include yeast because they weren't yet aware that yeast was the cause of fermentation. Fermentation was still an act of God. It was mystical, and it was unknown for another 300 years before Louis Pasteur identified yeast as the source of fermentation. And even a little bit before that, 1490 or so, when Christopher Columbus was going over on his accidental discovery of the West Indies and America, he found that Indians in the islands and on the coast of America were brewing their own form of beer using corn and sap from trees. So beer was definitely being brewed in other parts of the world independently and using the ingredients that they had available at the time. A little bit later, you have the Bavarian guilds forming the first official beer guilds, which meant that there were beer masters and apprentices, and people were learning the career of brewmaster. Around this time also, the Beck's Brewery was founded, and of course, it's still operational today. An interesting note is that during this time, beers were probably a little bit dark and smoky compared to what we think of today. The technique used to dry the malt, or the barley that was used to make the beer, probably involved an open fire, which meant that the malt would be slightly cooked or charred, it would change color, and it would change the flavor. A little bit later, in the 1600s, there was a technological advancement which allowed malt to be dried clean, pale. This is a time when the introduction of coke into the furnace changed the fire from smoky to clean. So we were able, for the first time, to dry barley without making it smoky and dark. And this led to the word pale. All of the pale ales, pale lagers, and lighter colored beers that we know today wouldn't be possible without this advancement in barley drying or malt drying technique. So this is around the time where in the UK you have ales becoming more popular. Germany and the Eastern Europe is famous for lagers, pilsners, beers that are crisp and clean and cold. In the West you have ales, beers that are a bit more fruity and a bit warmer fermentation. So the main difference between ale and lager is going to be the flavors that the yeast exhibit. Also the temperature at which they're fermented. Ale is fermented warmer, which allows the yeast flavors to come through into the final beer. Lager is fermented much colder, which makes a crisp and more clean flavor beer that highlights the flavors of the barley and the malt. At the time, people didn't know that yeast existed, so what they were doing was actually genetically modifying through selective breeding the yeast that they were using. Ale yeast were recycled by the brewers. They couldn't go to the homebrew shop and buy an ale yeast. So what they learned was that if you keep a bit of the finished beer and put your fresh beer on top of it, it will produce a similar product. At the same time, they were doing it at a warm temperature. This created the ale yeast that we know of today. In Germany, they were doing the same thing, but at a colder temperature. So the yeast changed because of the technique that the brewers were using. There were also beers being brewed in Belgium by Trappist monks that were wild fermentation or spontaneous fermentation. In this case, they weren't pouring fresh beer on top of old beer to recycle the yeast. Instead, they were creating the fresh beer and allowing wild yeast from the air to settle on the beer and create a new type of fermentation, a wild or spontaneous fermentation. The beers that came out of this process we know as lambic or gueuze, a sour Belgian beer. The monks were obligated to brew beer because beer was the liquid of the day. It was the most popular beverage. So they brewed beer for themselves. They wanted to remain self-sufficient. The monks grew their own food, they made their own bread and cheese, and they brewed their own beer. But they were also able to sell this beer to the common man. Today, many of those breweries still survive, and we know them as the Trappist breweries of Belgium. A lot of the classic styles that they brewed 1,000 years ago are still being brewed today. The Belgians also didn't care about the German purity law, so they were adding a lot of ingredients that the Germans would never put into a beer. Things like herbs and spices. They would add seasonal ingredients from their garden. Whatever was fresh and readily available could find its way into a beer. But the story doesn't end there. A lot of the brewers and the styles of beer left Europe for America. They crossed the Atlantic and began a new brewing experience in the USA. They went through a period of prohibition where all breweries were basically closed. And after that, there was a resurgence. So please join us for episode 3, The Modern Era of Beer and the Craft Beer Revolution.